Heidegger advisedly strums up new terminology in order to, as it were, flee from the previous position, as though in this way he could immediately leap. Let's look at let's look at why it's totally defective to simply speak of Heidegger as existentialist, or what does existentialism mean? There's a good Brian McGee presentation on what existentialism meant, as it were, not in a big historical way, but as it were to the people like himself who were really closely studying it, and then also to some extent covering what it meant, as it were, culturally. But what I want to look at is what it means for the for thought. So it seems to be that the first avenue to existence is to go away from propositional truth. But we hear this all the time without ever being explained what this means. The point about proposition is not a new point, but it's the point that's already made in Plato, and thus Heidegger already has the presentation, for instance, in the Euthydemus, which is often regarded as a comic dialogue, but comedy corresponds to almost the entirety of human life, so far as tragedy is something requires greatness and all kinds of things that are very rare. And Plato's point is, or let's say Socrates' point, is that the language depends on the what the user of the language intends, and that the words don't simply mean on their own without reference to the moment that they're used. But let's transport this into, this means the same thing as there's just certain reference to usage, and then you have to ask, what did you mean by that? You said such and such, but were you being ironic? Were you in a humor? Were you joking? That's why there's a big deal about in Christianity about and in Aristotle too. But couldn't have. This thing is valid as long as he wasn't joking when he said it. It's in legal speech. The judge can't be joking when he passes out a sentence, for instance. But in the modern context, this is still true, but it's presented usually in this sense of that a statement is meant to be always the same. So this John Stuart Mill is been sort of at the foot of British modern logic, and he said psychology is subordinated to this logic, or in a certain sense identical to it, which corresponds also and is homologous also in its sort of movements to the notion that psychology, of course, originally about the psyche or the soul, psyche, becomes Bewusstsein or consciousness, and then instead of speaking of the soul and the types of life as that go with the different psyches, logos, thumos, and bios. We talk instead about this sort of clinging on of the Bewusstsein or consciousness to whatever happens, and then in this way we also we're forced into the John Stuart Mill version. But the basic point is that the statement is supposed to always speak in the same way, as though there were some entity which was the neutral entity who could speak the truth outside any possible context. So this gets sort of misunderstood because, and then the point of existentialism is then that when we speak, we're never in this neutral state, so that we can state something and that it could be exactly the same thing the next time it's stated. Because we always have some disposition, we have some purposes, we have some humor, we have the world is in some condition, and this thing about the statement saying the same thing is supposed to be not something that arises in the sense that wariness or stimulation arises in a being, but rather something that is always the same and corresponds to this type of investigation Heidegger is making when he's talking about the Agleichung, or the principle of identity, the so-called first law of thought, which then he's bringing into context of John Stuart Mill's first half of the 19th century logic, which was so much responded to, which so much created a inverted point amongst the Germans. And then you had this two different mindsets about this, and Dilthey came out with his division between the causal and lived experience. And whereas in Mill's version there is no such division. So existence then presents itself first as what I wanted to mention is just that one is always sort of, here's the tricky point, is that since the beginning of philosophy we had the notion that the sort of the tranquil at easeness of the Hierophants in Egypt made it possible for, according to both Aristotle and Plato, Socrates, to produce the mathematics, or to put it this way, to do those things which the human being is meant to do when it's in the state that's sort of like if you had a orange of a certain kind and you put it in northern France, it wouldn't produce the best fruit, but if you put it in the orangery, it would produce a better fruit. What are the conditions for the human being to produce the best thought? Maybe not put forward in terms of production, but what are the best conditions for it to glimpse the ideas, or to come upon the things that its properly, its telos is meant to bring it to, let's say. So this is not neutrality, right? This is not neutrality. This is to be contrasted with the notion of the neutrality, or the statement always says the same thing in the same way. That's a subtle move. It's already there, but it's not pushed at as neutrality in Plato and Socrates. Rather, it's sort of treated as it's like in antiquity, Plato's dialogues were usually studied in quads, so that one would say a certain type of man in a certain position, in a certain stage of life, would read these four dialogues. And during the second sophistic, for instance, there's a mania for this. We're trying to figure out which was the right four dialogues to read according to what one's situation was. And then the statements said different things to different people, but it was all part of this what Plato had and Socrates had prepared and had discovered, and was meant to be, as it were, healthy healthy or eminently salutary for the human being. But then we get this question just about the statement as pure scientific statement, but then there's no way to separate the statement as pure scientific statement from the so-called subjective statements. This is the tree. This is the autumn. And then, is autumn only something that people of a certain upbringing talk about because that's what they're used to, how they're used to understanding it? Is it something like a tertiary quality because it involves certain holidays? It's not simply something that could be presented in the form of an outward test or empirically. It involves somehow, to be autumn involves something else. And even if it could be and the only way we get around that then is to create artificial definitions and then call them scientific. You see that's tremendous. That's tremendous for wallpapering these problems over. Is that once you admit that there is no real situation we're talking about, and you go into the fictionalism, then you go into something that all it cares about is certain form of test, certain form of empiricism. Can this language, when repeated, sink us into these things which we've artificially defined? And then you get the questions like the I think his name is Bambridge, who came out with these questions about the systematic connections with respect to the problem of the universal, and these kind of things that the analytic philosophers think is an advance over through a certain reading of Wittgenstein, which is probably mistaken. They say, Wittgenstein has signaled this other approach to the Socratic question of universals, but it's actually that what they're doing is they're mathematizing it and they're bringing it into this neutral Hink state. They're bringing it into this punctum, which has a totally different Vorstellung behind it. Like we were talking about that in the last one. It's a totally different silence behind our breathing, as it were, that we don't know. They don't notice they're doing it because they take for granted that this is what this is sort of the purport of these questions are. What's the question we're asking? This is one way to look at the notion of a history of philosophy, is that there's every age is asking, and it's in Collingwood, every age is asking, sort of like trying to discover what question were we asking, and once they realize what question they were asking, is like, for instance, during German idealism, they were trying to find out what is the system, what is what the system was, that somehow totally blindingly like the moths to the flame. The philosophers were constantly burning themselves on this problem of the system until and Schelling's freedom essay is sort of like the last gasp with the system and its total claim to be the metaphysical Vorstellung, as it were, to be the thing that grasps the absolute. But the question here of existence then shows itself simply negatively out of, this is sort of what the whole thing I'm getting at. It just shows itself negatively, and you sort of infer it out of these questions. And then it's like, you can't then just, can you then just describe the situation and say, here's a situation where we've realized the problem of existence and neutrality and and all these problems, and suddenly now we're going to do fundamental ontology of being. This is what Heidegger is sort of trying to do, but again, I would say again he comes into ferocious combat with Nietzsche, who threatens to smash him.